Chapter 11 of the Brighton Boys in the Radio Service. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Tom Clifton. The Brighton Boys in the Radio Service by James R. Driscoll. Chapter 11. Tapping the Enemy's Wire. The following morning all of those who had arrived on the transports were established in a concentration camp, but it was merely for the purpose of inspection of men and equipment, and was not to be for long. It was that same day that the three boys from Brighton were for the first time assigned to a regular unit of the Signal Corps. Also, with a real thrill, they learned that they were almost immediately to see war service, for American troops were already in the trenches. It was a happy circumstance for the three lads that they had such a close association with Lieutenant Mackinson, for without question he had already gained an enviable reputation, and when he was ordered to emergency service and told that he might choose the 5 men were to be under his direction, his 3 assistants on the trip across were the first ones named. The other 2 were Tom Rawle, a fellow proportioned like their first friend in the service, Sergeant Martin, and a wiry, energetic, quick-speaking youth named Frank Hoskins. "We have a long trip before us," Lieutenant Mackinson informed them, "and we leave here on a special train in 2 hours. In a short time we will be in the thick of it." It was joyous information for the 5, and they set about their few preparations with a zest only experienced by boys, knowing they have important work to do and feeling capable of doing it well. "How long have you been over?" Joe asked of Tom Rawle. "Got here 2 weeks ago," the big fellow answered, "but I haven't any real service yet. I was assigned once to Cambrai, but before I reached there a big drive was under way, the Germans being pushed back, and the detachment to which I had been assigned was so far forward that my orders were changed and I was sent back here." "Did you get within sound of the big guns?" asked Slim excitedly. "I should say so," answered Tom Rawle, "and so will you within a few hours. Isn't that so, Hoskins?" "Yes," answered Frank, "and when you do you get an idea of the fighting qualities of the French and Americans, going shoulder to shoulder against the Boches." "Hoskins knows," explained Rawle, "for he got nearer than I did." "Only for a short time," Frank corrected modestly, "but they called it my baptism of fire. I was out one night with an advance party. We were nearly ambushed and had to beat a quick retreat." "Well, tell them all about it," demanded Tom Rawle, impatient at Frank's unwillingness to talk much about himself. "Oh, they fired on us from a distance of about 100 yards," the other lad admitted, "and that was a surprise party for fair, I can tell you. When bullets begin singing around your head for the first time, and especially when they come without any warning from the enemy or any expectation on your part, it does give you a rather peculiar sort of feeling. They got one of our fellows in the party with a bullet in the arm. Then we all dropped on our stomachs and wriggled our way back into our own lines without any further damage. But we did some rapid wriggling, you can bet. There wasn't any time wasted by any of us, and inasmuch as we were apparently outnumbered, we did not fire back for fear of giving them an exact range of our whereabouts. After that I was sent back along the rear lines on an inspection trip, which brought me all the way to this point, where I was held for formation of this unit." "Say, that must be thrilling, to be a member of an advance party like that," said Jerry, his enthusiasm as fiery as his hair. "I wonder if we'll get any work like that." "You sure will," responded Rawle, "and plenty of it. You needn't worry on that score." At that moment Lieutenant Mackinson arrived to inquire if all their preparations had been made and if they were ready to board the special. "All ready," they answered, and the lieutenant led the way to the train. They found several others already on board, who were to make at least part of the trip with them. There were half a dozen men who had been slightly wounded in the trenches, and now, completely well, were returning to their regiments. Also, there was a wire company of the Signal Corps, which is going to join another American unit. For the first 3 or 4 hours of the trip the lads, even including Hoskins and Rawle, found the returning young veterans all center of interest, and from them they heard many serious and amusing stories, many true tales of the attack and retreat, of shot and shell and shrapnel and the hand grenade and the poisonous gas bombs thrown by the Boches. And then, one by one, the soldiers of Uncle Sam dropped off into a long and restful slumber that was to fit them for hard and difficult duties ahead. "This is where we get off," finally announced Lieutenant Mackinson, shaking the lads into wakefulness. "We leave the train here and travel the balance of the distance by automobile." Never had the boys seen such a powerful looking car as to that which an orderly led them. Without the waste of a moment they climbed in, Lieutenant Mackinson, our 3 friends, young Hoskins and the towering Rawle, In another instant they were speeding across the country with the break of dawn. But their trip now was far different from the one they had across England, where in that country they had seen big concentration camps and men preparing for war, with an occasional evidence of war effects in a building wrecked by a night air raid. Here, and in the eastern part of France, they came upon actual war in all its fateful progress, with whole towns demolished, forests and orchards blotted out, stark ruin written over the face of the earth. With a clear right-of-way, their high-powered machines swept past ammunition and food trains, long strings of powerful motor trucks driving towards the scene of action. They came upon towns and villages in the area known as "behind the lines," where French, American, Belgian and British soldiers were recuperating after hard days and nights in the front line trenches. By this time they were well within sound of the heavy guns, and their driver told them that the artillery duel then going on had been in progress for 48 hours at least. "Sometimes it lasts a week or more, you know," he said, "in preparation for a great infantry advance. But I understand that this time they expect to go forward before the end of today. Which means," added Lieutenant Mackinson, "that we probably get a chance to be right in the thick of it." On and on they went, and nearer to the scene of the actual battle they came. They passed the third line of trenches, and now in places they seemed to be in a straight line with some of the concealed artillery that was pounding away at the enemy in terrible detonations that shook and rocked the ground every minute. At the second line trenches their orders called for a halt. They did not have to be told that there was something doing. The road, so far as the eye could reach backward over the route they had traveled, was a constantly moving line of motor trucks coming forward with men and shells, while out ahead of them tremendous and menacing big tanks, the biggest things the boys had ever seen propelled on wheels or trackers, were pushing their uneven course toward the front in preparation for a new kind of assault. "They look like miniature battleships on land, don't they?" exclaimed Slim. The others agreed that was about the best description that could be given of these massive fighting machines, equipped with guns and men that could travel with their own power practically anywhere, across shell holes, over trenches, through barbed wire, the most human piece of war mechanism that had yet made its appearance on the battlefield. Summons to a long-delayed meal gave a welcome interruption to their guesses as to just what their first duties would be, and they had scarcely finished their substantial rations of food when an orderly informed Lieutenant Mackinson that he was to report at once to the field headquarters. "Await me here," he said to the 5 men under his immediate command. "I will probably be only a short time." And indeed, it seemed to them that he had hardly time to reach the headquarters when he was seen returning hurriedly. He gave some hasty instructions to the chauffeur, and the latter immediately began a quick examination of his engine and tires, which promised another early move. "We go forward as far as we can by automobile again," the lieutenant informed them, "and after dark tonight we are to establish an outlying communication from the furthest skirmish points to the headquarters." Almost as he finished his sentence they were started, but now their progress frequently was impeded, and occasionally a shell broke so close to them as to jar the machine from its course. None of the men in the rear seats of the car were cowards, but, aside from Hoskins, it was their first time under actual fire, and they marveled at the coolness of the driver, who seemed not to mind at all the dangerous quarters they were in. When they climbed out of the machine, half hour later, Joe remarked upon it in tones of open admiration. "It's nothing," the youthful chauffeur replied. "You get used to it, too." As he turned the automobile and started backward, Slim suddenly remembered that they hadn't even heard his name. "Don't know it," said Hoskins, "but he was wounded twice in the trenches, I heard while we were waiting for the lieutenant. That's why he's driving a car now. He has seen enough service to know that nervousness does not help." They had been directed to the quarters of Major Jones, in charge of the Signal Corps men in that section, and it was with considerable surprise that the boys learned, upon arriving there, that they were to accompany the lieutenant into the superior officer's presence for instructions. He was a man, they found, about 40 years old, already grizzled and hardened by his field experience, and he knew how to convey orders and transact business without a moment's delay. "You are to follow the red ink lines on this map," he told Lieutenant Mackinson, as they all leaned over his desk to follow the tracing of his pencil, with which he showed them the course they were to take. "When you reach this point," indicating a heavy spot about midway of the map, "you will seek a suitable location from which to establish communications. You will determine whether it can be done by wireless. As soon as you can do so, report what progress you have made. Use every caution, for you will be in the country occupied by the enemy. You should leave here about 7 o'clock this evening. It is now 6." 15 minutes later they had examined their arms and equipped themselves with a full supply of small arms ammunition, portable wireless instrument and antenna, and 3 rations each of eating chocolate. The latter article is dispensed to every soldier in the American armies just prior to an engagement in which he may become separated from his unit or companions, and if wounded might otherwise starve to death. The remaining 3/4 of an hour they spent in close study of the map that Major Jones had given them, and promptly at 7 o'clock they started upon the dangerous mission. With nightfall the big cannonading had noticeably shut down, but to the south of them artillery firing could still be heard distinctly. It was a black night, and they proceeded with the greatest caution. They did not dare use the flashlights that each of them carried, and frequently all of them would have to drop suddenly flat upon the ground as a big rocket went up from either side, lighting the whole section for traces of skirmishing parties. In this way they went forward, yard by yard, until they reached a thick clump of trees. There, after listening intently for several minutes without hearing a dangerous sound, they spread out their coats tent-like, while Lieutenant Mackinson, with gingerly flashes of his light, examined the map again to make certain of their location. They had hardly progressed 100 feet further when the unlucky Slim tripped and went sprawling on the ground with a pained but suppressed grunt. "Shh!" warned Lieutenant Mackinson in a whisper, while Tom Rawle, quietly chuckling at the fat lad's misfortune, aided him to his feet. "Down flat," said Mackinson again, as he discerned several shadows moving across a space a considerable distance to the north of them. For fully 10 minutes, which seemed like an hour, they lay there, not daring to move. They watched the enemy scouting party get like a scare, and then, after what seemed to be a whispered consultation, turned back to the German lines. "What did you fall over?" the lieutenant finally asked of Slim, in a scarcely audible tone. "I just found it," replied Slim. "It's a wire. Let me have your hand," and he guided the lieutenant's fingers down to what had been the cause of his downfall. "Copper!" exclaimed the lieutenant. "Hoskins, let me have that kit." And without the aid of a light he extracted from the leather case which Hoskins gave him a very small telegraph instrument. The instant it was attached to the wire the receiver began to tick irregularly. Neither Rawle nor Hoskins understood German, but to the others they were words easy to translate. They had accidentally struck an enemy wire and had tapped it. That part of the message which they had intercepted read: "Lead enemy to believe whole attack centered from your position, but main assault will be flank move around hill 20." At that instant a fusillade of bullets cut all around them, and the 6 men suddenly realized that they were under a pitiless and well-directed machine gun fire. End of chapter 11. Of the Brighton Boys and the radio service. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Tom Clifton. The Brighton Boys and the Radio Service by James R. Driscoll. Chapter 12. The SOS with Pistol Shots. To move from the position they were in was impossible. All they could do, imprisoned there as they were within a steel and leaden wall of rapidly falling machine gun bullets, was to hope that the gunners would not change their aim even by a fraction of a point, and that neither side would send up a torch rocket to divulge their exact whereabouts and bring sudden death or mortal injury to them all. They knew now that they had been discovered by the enemy scouting party which they had observed a short time before, as they thought, without the others knowing their presence there in no man's land. They also realized now, when it was too late, that the Germans had returned to their own lines after that brief consultation in order to procure the machine gun with which to wipe them out. And through it all they dared not return fire, could not even utter a word to each other without fear of giving the enemy a closer range upon them. It was a terrible 3 minutes for that isolated little group of Americans, for bullets were striking all around them, and the nearest not more than 10 feet away, and there was every possibility that another detachment might be flanking them to cut them off later in their retreat in case their machine gun did not effectively do its deadly work. There was but one desperate course open to them, and that Lieutenant Mackinson ordered the instant the firing ceased. "Run!" he ordered in a shrill whisper. "Run straight toward their own lines for about a quarter of a mile, and then detour to the south." And off they started, each with all the speed he had in him. The renewal of the machine gun fire compelled them to take a zigzag course, however, and in this way for the first 5 minutes they all kept together. Then Tom Rawle, who with the lieutenant had been a little in the lead, gradually dropped back until he was abreast of Joe and Jerry, who were running together, and then behind them, reaching Frank Hoskins and Slim, who were bringing up a loudly puffing rear. Finally, as they began to pass him too, his lagging pace became noticeable. He urged them ahead and told them not to mind him. "I got one of those bullets in the hip," Rawle told them, to the surprise of all, for up to that moment he hadn't uttered a sound. "Cuts down my speed, but it's nothing serious, I guess. You keep right on, and I'll follow as rapidly as I can." "I'm almost winded myself," said Slim. "I'll stick with Tom. You fellows keep right on. We'll join you in a few minutes after you stop, Joe. I'll give you the whippoorwill call if you can't locate you. At any rate, we know our way back to the American lines." "Not so loud," warned Lieutenant Mackinson as he slowed down. "I guess you're right," he continued. "You stay along with Rawle, but the two of you are to try to follow as quickly as possible so that we can get Tom back to the lines for medical attention. It is necessary that I have the others with me, though, for we must not only accomplish our mission, but also give the commander the intercepted German message." And so the little group parted. There in the blackness of night, somewhere in France, the lieutenant, Hoskins, Joe and Jerry to forge ahead as rapidly as they could in a detour that would again take them back into the enemy territory, but at another place, while Slim and the wounded Rawle came along at a slower pace. The latter had been wounded more seriously than he knew, though, for he had not gone more than 300 yards further before the loss of blood had so weakened him that he had to stop running and hobble along in a painful, limping gait, leaning heavily upon Slim's shoulder. "Guess I'll have to quit," he said, a little later on. "Can't go much further." And even as he spoke he sank to the ground. While Tom Rawle assured him that it wasn't much of a wound, Slim, who was doing the best he could to stop the flow of blood with his handkerchief, knew that it was a bad injury, indeed, unless it was given early attention. "I'll try to get one of the others to return," he said, "and then we can send to our lines for a stretcher to get you in." "Nonsense," said Rawle. "I can walk. I'll show you." But it was a pitiful effort and unsuccessful, and Tom himself had to admit that he guessed he was out of business for a little while. Thereupon Slim puckered his lips and imitated the low but far-carrying call of the whippoorwill, the call that he and Joe and Jerry had used so much to summon each other in Brighton. He remained silent for a moment, listening, but there was no answer except the distant rumble of the heavy artillery fire. He repeated the call several times. Here and there to the north of them occasional rockets went up from either side, but their brief light divulged nothing in the way of encouragement. "It's not going to do you any good to sit here without attention," said Slim at last. "Here is your revolver right beside you. I will be back in half an hour. I'm going to scout around for help." "But don't take any chances for me," Tom Rawle warned him. "I guess I could crawl back to camp at that." "No, you couldn't," Slim declared. "And mind you, don't try it. I'll be back for you in a very short time." He disappeared in the direction that the rest of the party had taken, leaving Rawle there to await his return. Half hour later he managed to find the spot again, but without the aid he had gone to get. Not a trace of the others had he been able to find. But that was not the worst of it. Tom Rawle, helpless for all his big body and physical strength, lay stretched out on the ground unconscious, a pool of blood by his side. Slim put his water flask to the man's lips and tried to rouse him, but without avail. "Whippoorwill!" whistled Sam. "Whippoorwill!" But the sound was lost somewhere in the denseness of the night, and there was not even an echo for response. Slim was growing desperate. At any time they might be discovered by an enemy scouting party, and then they would either be bullets' victims or prisoners of war. Yet he knew that he could not hope to carry Tom Rawle back to the American lines. Rawle's dead weight would have been a difficult burden for a man twice Slim's strength, and he knew it. What should he do? Unnecessary delay might cost the other man's life. Already his wound had caused him to lose consciousness. As he turned the thing over in his mind, there came faintly, ever so faintly, to him from far, far to the south, as he thought of but a breath of wind, the familiar "Whippoorwill." "Whippoorwill!" shrilled back Slim. He waited, but there was no answer. It was as though a poor whippoorwill itself was mocking his plight. "Whippoorwill!" Slim whistled again, and thrice, but each time there was nothing but the grim silence for reply. "Tom," he whispered in Rawle's ear, gently shaking the wounded man. "Tom, can you get up? I'll help you back. We can make it somehow together." But here again only the weak breathing of his comrade testified to their plight. "Better to take the one chance that's left us," muttered Slim to himself, as he pulled Rawle's revolver from under him to make sure that it was fully loaded. "Yes," he continued, "it is better to risk discovery than this fellow's life." He took his own automatic from his holster and carefully examined it also. Then, with a revolver in either hand, pointing into the air, and with 14 shots at his disposal, he began firing. Bang, bang, bang. Bang, bang, bang. Bang, bang, bang. The shots rang out on the night air like a series of interrupted explosions, but to the trained ears of other men of the party, Lieutenant Mackinson, Joe, Jerry, and Frank Hoskins, 2 miles away, they carried their call for help. It was the SOS of the International Code, but in a new sort of wireless, by pistol shots. Trembling for results that his desperate action might bring upon them, Slim waited, bending now and then over the unconscious form of Tom Rawle. But in 15 minutes his inventive genius was rewarded. From a considerable distance, but each time more distinctly now, came the repeated call of "Whip-poor-will," and in less time than it seemed possible that they could make it, the other group had returned. In low commands, the lieutenant directed affairs, and in exactly the way that he had been carried out in the hold of the Everett, on the verge of suffocation, so they carried poor Tom Rawle back to their own lines. And when he had been placed upon a cot in the first emergency hospital, Lieutenant Mackinson hurried off to make his report, in the honor of which they all shared. For not only had they found a location from which to wireless advance line communication to field headquarters, but they had also intercepted a message, knowledge of which resulted in a quick change of plans by which the Americans were able to beat the enemy at his own game on the morrow. Rawle was suffering more from the loss of blood than any seriousness of the injury itself, the surgeon told them when they asked there of their friend's condition on their way back to their own quarters. He'll be around all right again in a week's time. And so, much desperate work accomplished on their first night within the firing lines, the lads threw themselves upon their cots to dream of spies and captured Germans and injured soldiers and calls for help by new methods in wireless. End of chapter 12. Of the Brighton Boys in the radio service. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Tom Clifton. The Brighton Boys in the Radio Service by James R. Driscoll. Chapter 13. The Cave of Death. It is one of those fortunes or misfortunes of war that a position gained one day, even at great human sacrifice, may be of no real or practical value whatever the next. So it was with the advanced post of communication located by Lieutenant Mackinson and his party under such dangerous conditions during the night before. The information which they had gained through tapping the enemy's wire enabled the American and French troops, operating together to prevent the German trick from being carried into effect. More than that, it enabled them to turn the knowledge of those plans to such good advantage that the Allied brigades swept forward in terrible force against the weakest point in the enemy line. They pushed the whole Boche front back for more than a mile, at the very point where it had been considered strongest. As a consequence, the point of communication which the lieutenant and his aides had established with so much difficulty was now well within the territory held by the American and French fighters. The requirements for a further advance now made it necessary to have another outpost point of communication as near to the enemy trenches as the first one was before the day's battle put the Allies a mile further forward. And so, except for Tom Rawle, who was resting easy from his hip wound, the same party started out at the same tune for the same purpose on the second night, but with a very much sharpened realization of the obstacles they had to overcome and the chances they faced of being wounded or captured. "We take an entirely different direction," Lieutenant Mackinson told them as he looked up from the map he had been studying. "We go to the north and east and as close to the observation trenches as possible." Now the danger of this can readily be seen from considering what an observation trench is. The front line trenches of the opposing armies, of course, run in two practically parallel lines, but an observation trench runs almost at right angles with the front line trenches and directly towards the enemy trench so far as it is possible to extend it. The extreme ends of these observation trenches are known as listening posts, and often they are so close to the enemy lines that the men in the opposing army can be heard talking. Lieutenant Mackinson and his aides, Joe, Jerry, Slim, and Frank Hoskins, were to get their signaling location as near to an enemy listening post as possible. In other words, they were to court discovery in an effort to get just a few feet nearer the enemy than they otherwise would. They went along much as they had on the preceding night, except, had there been light enough, it might have been noticed that Slim, in his walking, pushed his feet forward cautiously and then, in stepping, lifted them high from the ground. But as luck would have it, they had not gone more than 200 yards when a bullet whizzed within 2 feet of Jerry's head, followed by a shower of missiles that were directed entirely too close to them for comfort. Instantly they dropped flat on the ground. In the distance ahead of them they could see 3 shadows stealthily crawling along towards them. "Pick your men," Lieutenant Mackinson ordered in a whisper. "Fire!" Their automatics let out a fusillade of bullets. 2 of the shadows jumped slightly into the air and rolled over. The third man rose and started to run toward the enemy line. Frank Hoskins took deliberate aim and fired. The man dropped and lay still. "Looks as though we got him," said Lieutenant Mackinson, "but they may only be pretending. Do not move for a few minutes." Thus, while they were waiting, the enemy trenches sent up a glaring rocket. It fell shorthand, failed to reveal them, but it plainly showed 3 German soldiers lying prone upon the ground, all of them apparently instantly killed. "That's the part I don't like," muttered Slim with a shudder. "It isn't so bad when you're firing into a whole company or a regiment and see men fall. At least, it doesn't seem so bad, for you don't know just which ones you hit and which ones someone else bowled over. But in this individual, close-range stuff, it leaves a nasty feeling." "You're right," whispered Frank Hoskins, "but you better not talk any more about it now, or some Boche may try the same close-range stuff on us." Warned to silence by the lieutenant, they continued to creep along, only a foot or so at a time, stopping every few minutes to listen intently to see if their presence had been discovered. On the night before they had been upon fairly level ground, but this night they were in a section that was all hills and hummocks and hollows. They would creep cautiously up the side of one mound, not knowing but that on the other side lay a group of Germans, perhaps out upon a similar mission. For no one can tell what may happen in no man's land, that section belonging to neither side, before and between the front-line trenches of the opposing armies. "With that star as my guide, I am certain that we would not have turned from the proper direction," Lieutenant Mackinson whispered, as they came to a halt in a secluded spot that seemed safe from attack as from observation. "We have passed the 5th hill. 15 more minutes should bring us to the place which Major Jones indicated on the map. It is sort of a natural trench. If we reach it all right, we are to string a wire from there to our first observation trench to the northwest of it. I believe that the same place has been used for the same purpose before, during the long time that all this has been contested ground. An outpost there can observe and report every activity of the enemy in daylight without himself being seen." They began again to creep forward, now flat upon their stomachs and only raising themselves from the ground a little way, but at infrequent intervals, in order to make sure of their position and that they were not being watched. "Listen," hissed Frank Hoskins, who was a little to the left where the others were snaking their way along. They all stopped moving, almost stopped breathing. What was it? Lieutenant Mackinson barely breathed after several minutes of silence. Hoskins crawled nearer before he spoke. "How near are we, Lieutenant?" he asked. "I should say about 100 yards." "Look straight ahead of us when the next rocket goes up," Hoskins suggested. They had not long to wait for one of the great sky torches to come sailing over the side of the German trench, but a considerable distance from them. "Did you notice anything?" Hoskins asked. "I didn't," whispered the lieutenant. "Did you?" "I thought I saw a half-dozen men," said Joe. "We'll wait then and see," said Lieutenant Mackinson. In a moment another rocket went up, this time from the American-French side, and it clearly showed what Frank and Joe had both seen. 6, perhaps 7 or 8 men were crawling along, headed toward them. "They're making for the same place," said Jerry. "Exactly," replied the lieutenant. "It means that we've got to fight for it. We'll have some advantage if we can beat them to the protection at the base of that hummock." As rapidly as possible they started forward. Lying out flat, they would draw their feet upward and towards them, rising slightly and going forward upon their arms. This action, which put them ahead a few inches every time, they repeated times without number, but it was slow progress at best, and made slower by the interruptions of rockets. "We're almost there," Lieutenant Mackinson whispered, "but I think we've been discovered. Lie flat and don't make a move. By keeping my head in the position I have it, I can watch the other group. If we've been seen, it means a running fight to the mouth of that trench or cave." Another rocket cut a glaring path across the sky. Again it was from the American-French side, and illuminated the black shadows strewn along the ground like little clumps of low-growing bushes. "Ah!" exclaimed the lieutenant suddenly, and then in the same breath, "Up and at 'em, boys!" Before the others had an opportunity to realize what had happened, Mackinson was dashing at top speed toward the indicated trench or cave, firing as he went. As they followed suit, but more careful in their shooting for fear of hitting him, they realized that the men in the enemy group were doing the same thing, running as fast as they could for the same position. "Drop!" ordered the lieutenant, and they did so, but it was as if he had issued the order for both sides, for the others were not a second later in seeking the security of the ground. "Either side may begin playing machine guns on us at any moment," the young officer whispered between gasps for breath. "Forward as quickly as possible and continue firing." How they ever escaped the enemy bullets as long as they did, none of them ever knew. But the men of the other side were just as doggedly determined, and no less courageous, even if three of their number already lay stretched out motionless and useless upon the ground. And so the battle waged until both groups were no more than 50 feet away from the mouth of the natural trench. Each moment brought them closer together, with the even more vigorous popping of their guns, for by now it was virtually a hand-to-hand battle. Only 4 men now remained upon the side of the Germans, and, so far as numbers were concerned, the Americans seemed to have the advantage by 1. But the score was even an instant later when one of the Boches winged Frank Hoskins, and his right arm fell useless at his side. But Lieutenant Mackinson squared accounts for Hoskins by putting another German completely out of commission. A prompt return compliment knocked Jerry's revolver out of his hand. At this juncture Slim played a heroic part by laying low another German. Seeing themselves now outnumbered almost 2 to 1, for apparently they did not know that they had injured Hoskins, the remaining 2 Boches took one final, despairing survey of the situation, then turned and started on a dead run for their own lines. Lieutenant Mackinson leveled his revolver at him, held it in the position for a moment, and then, perhaps it was an accident, seemed to elevate it slightly in the air and fired. Certainly neither German was hurt by the bullet, although it did seem to add a little to their haste. "The position is ours," announced the lieutenant exultantly, and then, suddenly remembering that Frank Hoskins had been hit and that Jerry had dropped his gun, he inquired, "Hurt badly, Frank? And how about you, Jerry?" "Nothing but a scratch," said Frank. "Took me right on the crazy bone and made me jump for a minute, but it's hardly bleeding now." "Only hit my gun," announced Jerry, "and I recovered that." There was no time for further conversation. The Germans had reached their own lines, and a machine gun was being trained upon the Americans. They rushed headlong to the north side of the little mound and into the opening of a natural cave. The earthwork made them solidly entrenched, as though they were behind their own lines, and only heavy shells could dislodge them. But they had work to do, and the nature of it required that they do it quickly. The entrance faced almost directly north and into no man's land, so that the light of an electric flash, such as they all carried, hardly could attract the attention of either side. "Joe," said the lieutenant, sizing up the situation, "it is not safe to leave the enemy unwatched for a single second. I think it would be well for you to stay on duty outside, while the rest of us rig up the instrument and begin to unspool the wire. Hoskins, you're hurt, so you stay here with Joe, but both of you be mighty careful not to expose yourselves where you'll stop a German bullet." With Lieutenant Mackinson leading, Jerry just behind them, and Slim bringing up the rear, they crossed the 5 feet of narrow passageway back into the natural dungeon. The lieutenant switched on his light. Involuntarily and with a startled gesture he stepped back. "Jumping Jupiter!" exclaimed Jerry. "What is that?" Slim, peering ahead of the other 2, ejaculated something between a shriek and a groan. Strewn about the ground of that cave, in every conceivable position of misery and torture, were the bodies of a half-dozen dead men, all Germans. The lieutenant's hand that held the light trembled slightly as he stared at the ghastly scene before him, but he was grit and courage right through to the heart. "This is bad business, but we are under orders, and we must go through with it. We cannot move these bodies out tonight." He stepped further into the dark hole, and the other 2 lads followed. Suddenly, from behind them, there was a grumbling, roaring crash, pierced by a cry of warning from Joe outside. The 3 whirled around, and for a moment no one could utter a word. The mouth of the dungeon had completely caved in. "Trapped!" gasped Jerry, who was the first to find his voice. Even the lieutenant seemed dazed. "Trapped," echoed Slim, "in the cave of death." End of chapter 13. The Brighton Boys in the radio service. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Tom Clifton. The Brighton Boys in the Radio Service by James R. Driscoll. Chapter 14. Desperate Measures. Never did three young men face a more terrible or more horribly gruesome situation. Here they were, locked in a natural dungeon behind a wall of dirt and rock probably 4 or 5 feet thick. Not only that, but the cave already contained the bodies of 6 men, whose fixed and glassy eyes stared at them as though in mockery and warning, and the already foul air was becoming more stifling every moment. In a dull way they realized that they probably could not survive more than 2 or 3 maddening hours in that death chamber. "It may not be so bad as it seems," said the lieutenant, in a voice that seemed unnatural in the vault. "Perhaps it was only a slight cave-in." He flashed his light about the hole. It was difficult to tell where the opening had been. "Joe and Frank Hoskins!" cried Jerry, in a new terror in his voice. "I heard Joe shriek!" Slim, catching his meaning, snatched a rifle beside one of the bodies, and with the butt of it began pounding frantically upon the side of the cave where the entrance had been. There was no answering knock. "Joe!" shouted Jerry in a frenzied tone. "Joe, can you hear me?" No answer came either from Joe or Frank. "Pin under tons of that stuff," gasped Slim, the words trembling upon his lips and a tear trickling down his cheek. "I do not think so," the lieutenant answered them. "Both Joe and Frank were upon the outside when we entered." "But they would try to get us out," said Jerry. "If they were out there they would give us some signal that they were trying to help us." "We might not be able to hear them," answered the lieutenant, even against his own judgment. "But look at it this way. Even though they never were inside, they had a fair idea what the place was like. They knew from that we needed help, and needed it quickly. If one went alone, and anything happened to him on the way, the other might wait here indefinitely, not knowing whether he had gotten assistance or not. By going together they took the safest course." And Lieutenant Mackinson's reasoning was correct. That was exactly the way Joe and Frank had figured it out. The latter forgetting all about his own wound, they had started as fast as they could for the American front. "Keep cool, conserve your energy, and I feel certain everything will be all right," the lieutenant told his two friends, with whom in such a short time he had already gone through many harrowing experiences. At that very same moment, a quarter of a mile away, Joe brought his companion to a halt, took out his flashlight, and, facing the American lines, began making and breaking the connection in a way to give a number of short, even flashes. Presently a light appeared, was extinguished, and appeared again at the edge of the French-American lines. Joe had resorted to another sort of wireless, the blinker, and, not knowing the call signal for the station he was nearest, had given the prescribed call in such a case, a series of short flashes or dots. The station had acknowledged, and he had begun sending his message out of the little battery in his hand. "Americans. 3 of party caught in cave. Need help." And the answer was flashed back in the same code: "Approach, keep light on, countersign." Following these instructions, with Joe in the lead and the flashlight held out in front of him, they dashed on to the trenches. They gasped out the countersign and were escorted by a sentry to the quarters of the officer in that particular section. In a few words they told him what had happened. Without an instant's delay the latter, a colonel of artillery, reached for his telephone. "Ask Captain Howell to come here immediately," he said, and severed the connection. He seemed already to have decided upon some sort of a plan, and his decisive manner gave the two lads a feeling of confidence in him. He reached into the drawer of his desk and drew out a large map. He ran his fingers across it, and then came to a stop at a little black dot which appeared just in the angle of 2 converging red lines. "Is that it?" he asked, turning to Jerry and Frank. They examined the map carefully for a moment and told him that it was. Just then Captain Howell entered. His boots were splattered with mud, his face was grimy, and his eyes were bloodshot, indicating that he had been for many hours without sleep. "Captain," said the colonel bluntly, "these young men are the Signal Corps, as you can see. They were detailed tonight to establish an outpost wire communication to Hill No. 8. You know it?" "Very well, sir," the captain replied, his interest increasing. "Well," continued the colonel, "they got there all right, but the other 3 in the party had hardly entered the hole when the entrance caved in." "Great Scott!" ejaculated the captain. "I know that cavern. They can't last there long." "Exactly," affirmed the colonel. "What's your suggestion?" For a full moment Captain Howell was silent. "There's only one way," he said finally, "and that is a dangerous way. Blast them out." "Blast them out?" repeated the colonel, but apparently without surprise. "How?" "It would take too long to dig them out," Captain Howell answered, "and besides, that could hardly be done without some sort of light, and that would attract enemy fire. There is but one chance, and that is to blast them out with one of our big guns." "Can you do it?" the colonel demanded again, in his blunt, insistent way. "I will do my utmost to save them, sir," Captain Howell replied. "Very well, then," answered his superior officer. "If you feel certain that is the only way, go ahead. Personally, knowing the place as I do, I see no other method myself. Have you the range?" "I did have, sir," said Captain Howell, "but in such a delicate matter as this it would be necessary to be absolutely accurate. We have been firing practically all day, and the position of the guns changes slightly, of course. I would want to find a new and exact range." He had noticed Frank's limp arm, and turned to Joe. "Take this flashlight," he ordered. "It is more powerful than yours. Get back there as quickly as you can and follow to the letter these directions. Keep between us and that hill until you get there. Stay on this side of the hill and crawl around toward the entrance until you get to a point where you can see this light, facing us 2 feet above the ground and 1 foot from the outer surface extremity. Leave it there until you see 3 quick successive rockets go straight up in the air from here. After that I'll give you 3 minutes in which to get back to a place of safety. I'll put that flashlight out of business, and I think I can liberate your friends." "Is your injury a serious one?" the colonel demanded of Frank. "Very slight, sir. Only a flesh wound," Frank responded eagerly. "Then take this light," the colonel ordered, "and follow him at a distance of 100 yards. If anything should happen to your friend, you follow the directions you have just heard." "Yes, sir," the lads responded in unison, and with a hasty salute were off. 3 times did Joe drop to the ground, as a shadow seemed to move somewhere out in the distance before him. But each time he was up and off again almost upon the instant, thinking of his own safety only as that of his 3 friends depended upon it. And what of those inside? Even the courageous Lieutenant Mackinson was beginning to show the anxiety he felt, while Jerry and Slim, despite their bravest efforts, gave way to occasional expressions of the horror of the thing. They had pounded upon the walls until they had been overcome with despair. Then they had set to work digging with the only instruments in hand, the bayonets on the Germans' rifles. But soon they realized that this, too, was as hopeless as the pounding, for it further exhausted the energy which the foul air was rapidly sapping, without making any apparent opening in the thick earthen wall that surrounded them. "Well," said Slim at last, gulping back his nausea and smiling almost in an old-time way, "I'm as anxious as anybody to keep up hope to the last. But if this is to be our end, I guess we can face it as Americans should." "Bravo!" exclaimed Lieutenant Mackinson. "I always knew that each one of you fellows had the right sort of stuff in you." And Jerry, too, slapped him affectionately on the back. "Slim," he said, smiling over at his chum, and ready for his pun, even under such circumstances, "my head is feeling a trifle heavy, but I'm game to stand up to the last." Thus they sat down to wait for just what they did not know, while at that very moment, 4 feet away from them on the other side of the wall, faithful Joe was setting up the flashlight exactly according to directions. For a few seconds he waited, and then, 3 times in quick succession, a rocket went into the air from just behind the American lines. Over there Captain Howell himself found the range, submitted it to the most expert gunner, who verified it, and then they waited for the 3 minutes to elapse, during which Joe was to seek a place of safety. It was in that interval, too, that fate intervened for those within the cave, for they were sitting with their backs to the very point against which the shell was to be directed. "We need all our strength," Lieutenant Mackinson was saying. "So long as possible we want to remain in full possession of our senses. The air is purer nearer the floor. I think it would be better to lie down." And following his suggestion and example, the other 2 stretched themselves out in the middle of the cavern. Within the American lines, at that point where a regiment of heavy artillery was stationed, Captain Howell raised his hand in signal to his gunner. Out on the parapet of the front trench an anxious colonel was standing, regardless of all danger, a pair of powerful glasses to his eyes. His vision was focused upon a little light far out in no man's land. 200 feet away from that light, Joe and Frank Hoskins lay prone upon the ground, silent, impatient, fearful, hoping. With a quick motion the artillery captain swung his outstretched arm downward. There was a roar, a flash, and a great shell tore through the air. Out in no man's land there was a second explosion as a shell hit, and the target, a flashlight, was blown to atoms. Over in the German trenches a sentinel chuckled at the thought of another wasted American shell, but out of the hole that shell had torn, three pale, haggard, and exhausted youths were crawling to safety and God's fresh air, and across no man's land dashed two pals to greet them. American determination and American marksmanship had saved three American lives. The German sentinel might have his laugh if he liked. It was hours later before the three who had been in prison learned how their rescue had been effected, but they got an inkling of it as they came within 400 yards of the American-French front. "What are you doing?" Lieutenant Mackinson had asked as Joe brought the party to a stop. "Just a moment and you'll see," Joe had responded, and, first in wonder and then with a dawning of understanding, the other three read off his flashed message: "Signal Corps men and whole party safe." End of chapter 14. Of the Brighton Boys in the radio service. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Tom Clifton. The Brighton Boys in the radio service by James R. Driscoll. Chapter 15. The Surprise Attack. Promotion. During the week that followed, the lads were confined almost entirely to regular routine work, with nothing particularly exciting. Frank Hoskins' elbow wound healed quickly, without any serious results, and Tom Rawle, who had been under treatment at the field hospital, was able to get about the camp, although still pale and weak and limping considerably from his injury. But on the eighth day a veritable fury launched itself upon that section of the American-French front, in the shape of seemingly endless brigades of Boches that were hurled over the top of their own breastwork across no man's land and upon the first-line trenches of the Allies. For several days the American and French aviators had been reporting heavy German formations in that region, evidently with the design of a terrific assault, but the Allied commanders had not expected it so soon, and in truth they were not fully prepared for it. It was a surprise attack in every sense of the word, with all the terrible carnage that such a battle brings. Shortly before midnight of the preceding night a terrible bombardment had been directed against the American-French trenches and their hidden artillery to the rear of them. This was kept up for about 7 hours, and the duel of heavy guns shook the earth like a quake and was deafening. Then, just as dawn was breaking, the infantry onslaught, participated in at some points by detachments of cavalry, began. For 3 hours the Americans and the French fought stubbornly and with every ounce of strength and determination. Whole regiments and even brigades were wiped out on both sides, but the Boches, who had prepared every detail of the assault for weeks, were readier than their opponents and filled the gaps in their lines more quickly. By noon it became apparent that the sacrifice of lives was becoming too great to warrant the Allies trying to hold their first-line trenches much longer, and that they must give them up, at least till they could remobilize their forces for a counterattack. The order therefore was given for those in the rear, including food and ammunition trains, field hospitals, etc., to fall back in order to make way for the strategic retreat of those on the front when the moment for that retreat came. Everything moved like clockwork and with the greatest possible speed. And throughout it all men on both sides were shooting, shouting, shrieking, fighting, falling, while others trapped in their dugouts either surrendered or fought desperately on until they fell wounded or lifeless before superior numbers. Half a mile in the air, apparently over a point midway between what had been the first-line trenches of the opposing armies, a stationary balloon showed where Jerry and an observation officer were doing duty on that fateful day. Jerry was operating a telephone that ran directly to division headquarters, and hardly a moment passed when he was not repeating some observation of the other man in the basket with him, or relaying him a query from the commander below. Every detail of that tremendous battle Jerry knew. His own occasional glimpses over the side informed him of the temporary reverses his own army was suffering, while the remarks of the officer told him where the Germans were meeting their bitterest repulses, where they were drawing up their heaviest forces of reserves, what quick changes were being made in the general line of formation, and how far back their forces seemed to extend. Slim Goodwin, busy as he was with his wireless at headquarters, found time for occasional glances upward at that balloon to make sure that thus far his friend was still safe. And even in the thick of machine gun fire and shrapnel, where Lieutenant Mackinson, Joe, Frank Hoskins, and 2 or 3 others were laying a new line of communication, The wavering, swaying target was watched from time to time, and speculations made as to how long it could remain without being punctured by a bullet, thus forcing its two occupants to resort to their parachutes to make a landing. It was now well into the afternoon. The Germans had swept into the places vacated by the Americans and French, and still the battle raged. It was now that Slim began to wait anxiously for the new development, which his familiarity with the secret orders issued made him know it was coming. And finally it did come, in a way that staggered the Boches. The Americans and French had retreated to a general line which permitted a quick remobilization to the best advantage. There their front line ranks held firm, while the new formation was being effected behind them. It was about 4 o'clock in the afternoon when this was complete. Then, in concerted action, the lines opened at alternate points, and pairs, dozens, scores of the huge armored tanks rolled through, their big guns already blazing shells into the ranks of the disconcerted enemy. Nothing could halt them. They climbed trench parapets, descended into gullies, came out upon level land, and over their whole path swept destruction to the Germans. Unable either to resist or stop the progress of tanks, which were followed by whole divisions of infantry, the Boches were forced to retreat, and not only abandon every foot of ground they had gained, but to sacrifice a part of their own first line as well. It was one of the greatest and at the same time one of the most sudden reprisals of the war up to that time, and the victory that had been snatched from defeat was cheered by thousands of Americans and Frenchmen as they again took possession of their own trenches or pushed onwards across no man's land to occupy those which the Germans were now abandoning. The sun was setting, and soon, in great measure at least, hostilities would be suspended for the night. Their work completed, Lieutenant Mackinson and his men were on the way back to make their report when they met Slim, who had been relieved for the night at headquarters. "What time did Jerry come down?" Joe asked, after they had passed remarks about the various thrills of the day. "Dunno," Slim answered, "but I saw them there at 4 o'clock, and they weren't there yet when I looked again about a half hour later, so you can judge pretty well for yourself." "Guess he had a pretty good bird's eye view of the whole thing," said Joe, as they passed on to meet again before mess. Except for spasmodic outbursts here and there, the trench duel had almost entirely subsided, and the heavy roar of the artillery also was punctuated with longer pauses. Whatever the morrow might bring, the night promised to be fairly quiet, while each side took account of stock and made necessary repairs, or altered their plans to meet the new situation. Our young friends were busy with wash basins, soap and water, taking off the grime in preparation for the evening meal, and wondering where Jerry was keeping himself all the while, when suddenly a very strange thing happened beyond the enemy line. Lieutenant Mackinson was the first to discover it and call the attention of others. At Taube, one of the smaller, lighter, and more easily handled airplanes, and used in great numbers by the Germans, shot into the air at great speed from behind the Boche entrenchments. In its upward course its path was a dizzying spiral, and if one on ground might judge, its pilot seemed to be seeking a particular air channel. At least that was the way it looked. Then, from almost the same point from which it had come into view, a half dozen other planes rose into the air, following in path of the first, and also flying at top speed. Up to then there was nothing very strange about the whole procedure. It simply indicated that those manning the American and French anti-aircraft guns and the aviators of those two armies should get ready to repel an enemy air raid. But the queer thing occurred when most every one of the pursuing planes opened up their machine guns almost simultaneously upon the first. And even this might have been considered a well-designed hoax were it not for the unmistakable evidence that the first airplane, the Taube, had been hit. Still going at maximum speed, and now on a straight line towards the American side without seeking a further height, the Taube several times wavered, and a moment later almost turned over. But the pilot righted her, and even as the pursuers began gaining and still keeping up an incessant fire, he pointed her nose downward towards the American lines. 4 American planes sailed off and upward to meet the oncoming German air armada, but from the ground it could be seen that the man in the observer's place in the Taube was making desperate signals. The American planes maneuvered in such a way as to encircle the Taube, and yet at close enough range to examine her without particular menace to themselves. There were several seconds of crisscrossing and raising and descending, and then as a unit the American planes left the Taube and started after the German craft, which had hesitated as though uncertain which further course to follow. Several volleys of shots were exchanged, and the other German planes turned back towards their own lines. The Taube continued on its wavering, crippled, downward course towards the Allied lines. "Looks as though a couple of our own men had been reconnoitering the German lines in one of their own make of machines," said Lieutenant Mackinson, as the Taube came within 100 yards of the ground and righted herself for a landing. There was a general rush toward it as it hit the ground. Of its own momentum it rolled to within a 2 minutes' run of where the lieutenant and the others had been standing. In another instant it was entirely surrounded by a crowd of curious American soldiers. But they were surprised at seeing seated therein 2 men in the uniforms of the United States Army, and their feelings hardly compared with those of Lieutenant Mackinson, Joe, Slim and Frank Hoskins, as they recognized, stepping out of the Taube, Jerry and the observation officer with whom he had occupied the stationary balloon practically all the day. "Who are you? What happened? Where have you been?" And a score of similar questions were fired at them by the other soldiers as Jerry shook hands with his friends and the officer smilingly made away to file his report. "Well, to put it briefly," Jerry said, in answer to the general demands for information, "we were anchored off there most of the day in an observation balloon. Late in the afternoon a shell cut our cable, and almost before we knew it we had been carried behind German lines. The fight was still commanding the attention of most everyone, and after descending a little by permitting some of the gas to escape, we jumped over the side of the basket and came down on our parachutes. I landed in a deserted barnyard, and the officer hit the earth only a short distance away. While we were hiding there, debating just what we should do, along comes a Taube, and the pilot decides to make a landing almost at the same place. Well, the officer being a pretty good pilot, we decided to have that machine. We got it, and I guess that pilot's head aches yet where I pumped him with the butt of my gun when he wasn't expecting anything of the kind. But some other German aviators saw the affair, apparently recognized our uniforms, and hardly gave us time to make a decent start. Say," Jerry concluded, "they certainly did pebble us with machine gun bullets. I saw 2 bounce off the propeller and 1 broke a wire on the left wing, making us flap around rather uncertainly for a few minutes. It was a great race, though, and we considered our greatest danger to lie in the landing on this side. We knew it would be recognized for a German plane, and we were afraid we'd be fired on before we could make our identity known." Led by the lieutenant and Jerry, the party tramped back to where, shortly, the mess was to be served. "That air certainly does give a fellow an appetite," said Jerry, as he splashed more of the clear, cold water over his face. An orderly stepped up to Lieutenant Mackinson and handed him a large, officially stamped envelope. As he tore it open and read the brief note within, a pleased smile spread over his face. From the same envelope he extracted 3 smaller ones. He handed one to each of the lads who had accompanied him over on the Everett, according to the way they were addressed. Opening them, the boys could hardly suppress their jubilation. Stripped of their official verbiage, the letters informed the young men that each of them was made a corporal: Joe for valorous service in saving the lives of 3 Americans entombed in a cave; Slim for heroism and presence of mind in saving and bringing back to the lines an American soldier; and Jerry for coolness and courage, and for the information gathered behind enemy lines. End of chapter 15. Chapter 16 of The Brighton Boys in the Radio Service. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Tom Clifton. The Brighton Boys in the Radio Service by James R. Driscoll. Chapter 16. A Tight Place. Major Jones was paying his compliments in a very brusque, businesslike, but kindly way. Before him, standing at attention, Lieutenant Mackinson and Corporals Joe Harned, Jerry Macklin, and Slim Goodwin were awaiting important orders. "The manner in which all of you have performed your duties in the past has won you the esteem and confidence of your commanding officers," Major Jones said. "Your striking services not only have led to promotion, but to another important trust upon which much may depend. Through the mountains to the east of us a company of engineers is cutting a rough road. They work under great handicaps and frequently are harassed by enemy detachments, but they are making progress. This road is being cut for the purpose of permitting the passage of a wireless tractor, of which you young men are to be in charge. Through a part of that section an old telegraph still remains, but it does not connect in a direction to meet our requirements. Reports received this morning indicate that by night the engineers will have put the road through to a selected point where you will have the least difficulty in concealing your tractor and its aerials. From your position there you will keep constant vigil, for you will be able to inform us long in advance of any effort of the Boches to come through that way." The road winds about the mountainside, and in some places is quite steep, but the ground is now hard and the motor will make the pull. Goodbye and good luck to you." An hour later, with Frank Hoskins, who was an experienced driver, at the wheel, they started for their destination in one of the big, high-powered trucks which not only carry a complete wireless equipment, but also provide enough space for sleeping quarters for half a dozen men. As a matter of fact, these trucks are so designed that if necessary they can carry a crew of 10 men, while by means of a special clutch and gear the engine is made to drive an alternator for generating the necessary electrical energy which, under the most adverse atmospheric conditions, will give a sending and receiving range of at least 100 miles. In ideal weather the radius increases to as much as 250 miles. A powerful mechanism, which in its operation resembles the opening of a giant pair of shears, raises the mast and umbrella-shaped antenna, and the average time in getting the apparatus ready for service is only about 8 minutes. The entire tractor, including crew, weighs close to 5 tons, and it can be easily imagined that its operation on a steep and treacherous mountain road was far from easy and anything but safe. With them the lads carried sufficient rations to last them 5 days, it being understood that their larder would be replenished at the necessary intervals. They also took with them a radio pack set, which is another wireless apparatus that can be carried about with little difficulty. This they had in the event of any unexpected emergency. The entire pack set could be carried about in a suitcase, and after it was set up its current was generated by turning a crank by hand. Its range under ordinary atmospheric conditions was about 25 miles. The first few miles of their journey were accomplished with little difficulty, but as they struck the uneven, newly made road their troubles began to increase. At times the jolts were so severe that it seemed they would shake the electrical apparatus loose from the tractor, while some of the inclines were so steep that, attempting and failing to make them once, they had to go backward and try again with increased speed. It was bitterly cold, and while Frank and whoever at the time sat beside him on the front seat kept reasonably warm, being directly behind the hard-working motor, the others frequently got out to run along for a quarter or half mile to limber up their stiffened joints and get their blood in circulation again. One of their greatest difficulties came more than 3/4 the distance to their destination, and at one of the narrowest points along the road they met the large truck bearing back toward the camp, the company of engineers. The wireless tractor was chugging along under a heavy strain, but the other truck was coming down the steep grade under the compression of its engine to accelerate the use of the brakes, and with the little warning they had, the two drivers brought their big machines to a stop less than 10 feet apart. It was impossible for the truck containing the engineers to back up, and the first widening in the road over which the wireless men had come was fully a quarter mile behind. There was no other course then for Frank to reverse, and with a man on either side of the tractor in the rear, directing every slight turn of the wheel, to go back to that point. Once the engine stalled, making the stability of the whole weight of the heavy tractor depend upon the brakes. Frank grabbed the emergency and jammed it on with all his strength, but not before the machine had gained a momentum which made it a question for a few thrilling seconds whether or not the brakes would grip and hold it. As they finally rounded the turn which gave them the brief space of wider road, and the engineer's truck passed by, the men waving at each other a cheery farewell, the boys from Brighton gave a sigh of relief. When they reached what they had decided would be their destination, almost at the end of the road and in a dense bit of wooded section which would obscure them from the enemy observers, they brought their tractor to a stop. With a pick and a shovel they began building an earthen oven in which they might cook their food and from which they might keep reasonably comfortable without being seen. A light snow began to fall, and, mess over, the lads decided to retire for the night. Before doing so, however, they set up the mast and aerials and made the connection to the storage battery. It was agreed that they should set up in 2-hour shifts to be ready to receive any message that possibly might come, but it was arranged that the other 4 should divide this duty, allowing Frank, who had driven the truck over the entire trip, a full night's sleep. So the night passed, with the lads taking up turns at the lonely vigil. The snow continued, the wind increased almost to a gale, and the temperature dropped still lower. Fully 8 inches of snow lay upon the ground when gray daylight came, and Slim, the last man on the watch, awakened the others. The storm was diminishing, but still they could see only a few yards distant from the tractor. "Guess I'll warm up chopping some wood," said Joe, as he took an axe and left the others still dressing. In a half hour he had brought in enough to cook the breakfast and the last half of the day. and while Slim acted as cook, Jerry started out to fell more saplings. Before noon the clouds broke, the sun came out, and its reflection from the pure white glistening snow was almost blinding. "A snowball fight," suggested Jerry, and the others took up the idea as a boon to dispel the monotony of their isolation. With the lieutenant umpiring from the little wireless room of the tractor, Joe and Frank stood Jerry and Slim, and from a distance of 100 feet apart the battle began. One of Frank's well-aimed missiles caught Slim squarely in the mouth, just as he was calling out some challenging remark, and from one window of his post Lieutenant Mackinson laughingly shouted, "Strike one!" Slim, spitting and blowing out the icy pastry, gathered all his strength to hurl a ball back at Frank, but he wound up, as the baseball pitchers call that curving swing of the arm just before the ball is thrown, with such vigor that he lost his balance. His feet went up into the air and he came down kerplunk, but the snowball left his hand with what proved to be unerring aim. Joe, letting out a howl of laughter at Slim's accident, caught the tightly packed wad of snow right in the ear. He turned back to the enemy and, leaning forward, began pounding on the other side of his head to dislodge the snow. Of a sudden he straightened up, uttering an exclamation of surprise. "Lieutenant," he shouted, "look here!" The lieutenant jumped out of the tractor, and the others followed him on the run to where Joe and Frank were gazing off down into the opposite valley. 2, perhaps 3 miles away, a winding, twisting line of black against the snow was pushing its way laboriously toward the mountain base. "Germans!" exclaimed Lieutenant Mackinson. "Wait until I get my field glasses, but do not stand here where they might see you with theirs." From positions from within the clump of trees the lads watched the line spread out and slowly but surely forge its way ahead. The lieutenant returned with his glasses. "At least 10,000 of them," he announced at last, after gazing down at them for fully a minute. "And nobody knows how many more behind. We must notify camp at once." He ran back to the tractor, followed by all but Jerry, who remained to observe the enemy's further movements. In 2 or 3 minutes the wireless operator at headquarters signaled back for them to go on with the message. About 10,000 enemy troops proceeding through 8 inches of snow, bound northwest around eastern base of the mountain. Lieutenant Mackinson's message ran: "Am observing and will report progress. Any orders?" In another 5 minutes the wireless clicked back: "Are any of enemy flanking mountain on south?" Jerry, who at that moment entered the tractor, informed them that the Germans had divided into 2 diverging lines, apparently for that very purpose. There was a considerable pause after this was flashed to headquarters. Meanwhile Jerry had gone back to his post of observation, accompanied by Frank and Slim. "How many guns?" was the next query from the commanding officer of the American forces in the sector. Joe rushed out to where the other 3 were standing, and from them returned with the information that already they had counted 75 headed toward the north, and 5 being hauled toward a place where they might round the southern base of the mountain. This news was sent through space to the American army, and the lads, who were the silent witness to what the enemy had intended and fully expected should be a secret movement, waited in silence for further developments. "Can you get back over the same road with the tractor?" was the next message that came, and Lieutenant Mackinson called for more expert judgment of Frank Hoskins before answering. "We can try it," said Frank in a rather doubtful tone, "but it's risky business. It will be much as we can do to follow the road, and we can't hope to see the ruts and bumps. The worst part of it is, though, that the tractor is so heavy it may not hold the road. However, we can try." The lieutenant repeated the gist of this to headquarters, and the message came back: "Better try." But by the time this decision was reached the fire in the earthen oven had almost entirely died out, and the engine of the tractor, which had been drawn up to it, had become so cold that they had to build another fire to get hot water to put into the radiator before they could get it started. And then the perilous journey began. With Frank at the wheel and running the engine only in low gear, as compression against gaining speed, the lieutenant and Joe trotted ahead, one to either side of the road to indicate the course of the crude highway. Jerry and Slim, inside the big truck, were doing their best to hold things in place as they rocked and jolted over the deep ruts and gullies. It must have been this series of terrible jars that finally splashed grease and oil on the brake bands. Whatever the cause, it suddenly became apparent that at one of the steepest and sharpest turns in the whole route that the brakes were not holding. "Look out!" Frank shouted to Joe and the lieutenant ahead, as he realized the truck was getting beyond his control. "Better jump," he advised Jerry and Slim, standing just behind him. As Lieutenant Mackinson and Joe ran to either side of the road, the tractor slid by them at increasing speed. Slim and Jerry, following Frank's bidding, leaped from the rear and landed unharmed in a snowbank. "Run her into the side of that mountain," shouted Lieutenant Mackinson, and that was exactly what Frank was doing. It was the only possible way of saving the tractor from gathering more and more momentum and finally, beyond all control, leaving the road and hurtling down the steep slope. With all of his strength, Frank swung the wheel so as to turn the right side of the car at an angle up the mountain wall that flanked the road. In this position the machine was still traveling along with great force when it struck a thick, abutting ledge of rock. There was a sudden jolt, a sharp crack, and Frank was hurled forward head first into the snow. When they had brushed him off and made certain that he was uninjured, except for an awful jarring up, they began an examination of the machine. The right front wheel had been crushed to splinters. The axle was bent, and the machine was wedged so far under the split edge of the granite as to be, for the time at least, totally useless. "Better go back to where we were first," Lieutenant Mackinson said. "I'll take the pack set with us, and we can probably advise headquarters of our predicament with that, and also inform them of the progress of enemy movement." Wearily they turned about, each man loaded down with the necessities that they had to take with them from the wrecked tractor. It was nearing night when they reached the apex of the mountain again, and their first desire was to see whether the Germans had entirely passed around the mountain. So far as they could see, they had. But the Boches had done more than that. Their heavy guns were being sent around either side of the base of the mountain, each quota being part of a good-sized army, but they were sending another strong detachment up and over the mountain itself. And the first section of it was less than a mile below, spreading out in such a way that while part of it would come over the top, other parts would go around either side, and they would be fan-like in shape, forming a virtual comb in search for any enemies who might be lurking there. "The pack set," ordered the lieutenant. In a very short time it was set up, and Jerry was grinding the crank to generate power, while the officer flashed out the headquarters call. In a moment a message began to come: "JX, JX, JX." Lieutenant Mackinson nervously began tapping the key again, but the only reply was the insistent call for "JX," which was the code call for themselves. "No use," said the young officer at last. "We can catch them with their stronger range, but we haven't radius enough to send to them." "Those troops cannot reach here until dark," said Slim. "No," Lieutenant Mackinson acknowledged, "but they are in such numbers that we cannot hope to keep our identity or presence hidden, and they are getting around the mountain quicker than we can get down and beyond their line." "It looks as though we're hemmed in," said Frank Hoskins in an even tone. "Yes," agreed Jerry, "and in a tight place." End of chapter 16. Of the Brighton Boys in the Radio Service. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Tom Clifton. The Brighton Boys in the Radio Service by James R. Driscoll. Chapter 17. The Lieutenant's Invention. While the others speculated upon various means of escape, and in turn found that every one of their suggestions useless, Lieutenant Mackinson had remained silent and in deep thought. Finally, his countenance showing that he had arrived at a conclusion, he turned to the others. "Come with me," he said simply. "It's the only way." "Where are you going?" Joe asked quickly. "Back to the tractor," the lieutenant replied. "Hurry, we still have time, but none to waste." "But we can't repair the tractor," Frank argued. "No, we can't," Lieutenant Mackinson admitted, "but we may do something even better than that." "What?" queried all the lads at once. "Come with me and we'll see what can be done." And without granting them any further information, then Lieutenant Mackinson swung his share of the burdens to his shoulder and started down the rough mountain road, the others following and likewise bearing the various necessities which only a short time before they had labored so industriously to carry up the mountain. As they neared the point where they had left the wrecked machine, the young officer turned to Joe, who was nearest him. "Do you remember seeing that wire of the old telegraph line just about 100 yards below where we rammed the truck into the wall?" "I saw it," Joe admitted, "but I didn't pay any further attention to it." The others had come up within hearing distance. "Well," the lieutenant responded, If you had traced its course you would have seen that it has swung from this mountain to the one directly to the south, just at the point where the valley between narrows down to little more than a deep ravine." "But it doesn't run into our lines," Frank objected again. "That's true," Lieutenant Mackinson admitted again, "but it may serve our purposes just the same." "How?" Slim asked entreatingly. "Tell us what your plan is, Lieutenant." "No," replied the young officer in teasing tones, "I don't want to raise your hopes until I determine whether it can be accomplished." And he plodded on toward the tractor, refusing to answer another question. Indeed, it is doubtful if he heard them, for he was busy with some important mental calculations, problems that required his engineering knowledge and ability, and that had directly to do with the personal safety of every man in the party. "What tools have we here?" he asked of Frank Hoskins, as they arrived at the wrecked wireless tractor. Frank opened up the tool chest, that showed a great variety of implements in almost every size and shape. "Good," said the lieutenant, as he looked up from where he was rummaging in another part of the car. "Here, Jerry," he commanded, "let me have that mallet and cold chisel, then help me rip a couple of these boards off the floor." He laid aside a large pulley wheel, several nuts and bolts, and some heavy copper wire. With the aid of the mystified Jerry, he tore up two stout boards from the floor of the tractor. "Now we've got to work rapidly, fellows, for soon it will be dark. We don't want to attract attention ourselves by making a light. Here's what I'm going to try to do. That wire is strung really from mountain to mountain, running down a slight grade from where it's fastened here to where it's tied up over there. I don't know how strong it is, or how securely it's fastened to the other end, but I'm going to find out. You've seen all those trolley-like boxes that run on wires in department stores, with which the clerk sends your money to the cashier's desk and the cashier returns the change? Well, I'm going to construct something on the same principle, only I want to make it strong enough to carry my weight. If I can do that and the wire holds, the incline is sufficient to carry a passenger to the other end without any propelling power. I'll try it first, and carry with me one end of this reel of copper wire. If I get over all right, I'll attach the wire to the little oar, and you fellows can haul it back for the next passenger, and so on until all of us are over." Slim looked dubious. "How thick is that wire?" he demanded anxiously. "You know Slim's a trifle heavy," Jerry reminded the lieutenant. "Well," said Slim in a serious tone, "I'd rather fall into the hands of the Germans, and have some chance for my life, than splatter myself all over the bottom of that ravine." While this conversation was going on, Lieutenant Mackinson was boring a hole about 2 inches from each of the four corners of one of the planks taken from the floor of the truck. "This ought to do for a seat," he said, as he began running pieces of heavy copper wire of equal lengths through each of the holes. Then he laid this part of the work aside for a moment and began filing off one end of the riveted axle that held the pulley wheel in its frame. When he had knocked this axle out, he tried one of the bolts and found that it fitted almost exactly and that the wheel ran freely upon it. "Have to have that wheel off to put the thing on the telegraph wire," he explained, as he began securely fastening the copper wires into the bottom of the pulley frame. Completed, that thing looked all in the world like a miniature trapeze set. "Now," he said, slipping a wrench into his pocket and buckling on his legs a pair of spurs such as all linemen use to climb a smooth pole, "I'm going to take this up that telegraph pole with me and fasten this thing on the wire. Then it's all aboard for the opposite mountain. If I get over all right, I'll get one flash of my light. If I don't, well, don't try the wire route." Without wasting another second, he dug one spur into the pole and started climbing upward, dragging his improvised car with him, together with the loose end of the reel of copper wire. By this time it was pitch dark, and they could feel rather than see that he was tightening the bolt which hung the apparatus on the wire. The lads had placed a heavy stick through the reel, and two of them held it at either end. "Let her run free," the lieutenant told him, "and don't forget the signal. I'm ready. Good bye." There was a sudden jerk on the reel, and the wire began to unwind quickly. It literally spun round on the stout stick which they were holding. They just got a glimpse of the courageous lieutenant sailing off through space 1,000 feet above the bottom of the ravine. The unwinding wire gave an added spurt, and then, pressure being released from it, it began to slow down. "He's either on the other side or lost the wire," said Slim, his nervousness showing in his voice. Every eye was glued to the opposite mountain. "Look!" almost shouted Jerry. "He's safe!" Sure enough, the light had flashed out once in the blackness of night, and then as suddenly disappeared. The boys began hauling in on the copper wire, winding it again on the reel. "Who's next?" asked Frank, as the last bit of the cable was being rewound. "Eeny, meeny, miny, mo," Jerry began to count out, when Joe suddenly interrupted. By 10 feet of heavy twine Lieutenant Mackinson had tied the spurs to the car so that they would dangle within reach of the lads on the ground. Attached to them was a note, which read: "Easy landing on soft slope. Let Slim come next before wire is weakened, because he is the heaviest. All can make it safely." And so Slim, not entirely assured, and breathing somewhat heavily as he contemplated the distance he had to fall if the telegraph wire should break, was the next to climb astraddle the crude airline trolley on its second trip to the opposite mountain. In a few minutes the light flashed out again and then disappeared, while Joe, Jerry and Frank hauled in on the cable to which the car was attached. By mutual agreement it was arranged that Frank should be the next to go over, after which they would send the portable wireless, followed by Jerry, and finally Joe. Lads of less courage never would have attempted such a perilous escape, but they made it without a single mishap. It was not until Joe, the last of the party, was just coming to a stop in the outstretched arms of his friends, that the Germans below and on what was now the opposite side of the mountain seemed to sense something going on, or perhaps had seen the mysterious blinking of the flashlight, and so let go a distant and futile volley of shots. "No use, Boche," called the lieutenant mockingly. "We're out of your range, and now, having escaped you, we'll see what we can do to harass you." Saying which, he began opening up the pack set wireless, while two of the others set up the umbrella antenna. Lieutenant Mackinson began tapping off the headquarters call. It might have been the slightly nearer position they were in, or, so far as they knew, headquarters might have moved meanwhile, but in a very short time the operator was responding. The young officer gave an accurate account of the operations of the Germans, and particularly of their artillery. Headquarters thanked him, told him to stay until morning where they were, and then asked for further orders. In less than a half hour the boom of heavy guns from the westward told them that they had given their information in time. American artillery was dropping a rain of shells into the cuts in the mountain through which the Germans had to emerge with their guns to do anything. Their whole plan, so carefully laid out, had been defeated. End of chapter 17. Of the Brighton Boys in the radio service. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Tom Clifton. The Brighton Boys in the radio service by James R. Driscoll. Chapter 18. Slim Goodwin, a Prisoner. "If I had a good rifle I could pot a half dozen of them from here," said Jerry the following morning, as he and the rest, standing back among the trees of the mountain in which they had sought safety, watched two long converging lines of German soldiers marching back in the direction whence they had come on the preceding day. "And we owe them that much for that nice, nifty little night trapeze act we had to do through space on their own account," added Slim. "Not to mention the wrecked tractor," put in Frank. "Well," spoke Lieutenant Mackinson, calling them to the business of the day, "I guess we can make a report to headquarters now, and a good one, too." With which he opened up the wireless and began repeating the call letters. When headquarters had responded, the lieutenant gave them the glad tidings of the Boche retreat. That done, he proceeded to give the details of the wrecking of the tractor and of their escape to the second mountain. "Ought to be aviators," the operator at headquarters came back with him on his own account, and then added, "Wait for orders." These came a few minutes later. Divide as follows: Lieutenant and 2 men return here. Other 2 go forward at safe distance with portable and report tonight. Lieutenant Mackinson read them the message. "Well," he asked, "which 2 are to accompany me back, and which 2 are to stay on the heels of the Boches?" "I've got a scent like a deerhound," averred Slim. "And I was born to be a scout," declared Jerry. "You 2 spoke first," announced the lieutenant pleasantly, "so I guess that shall be your end of it, if that's all you want." "Fine!" exclaimed Jerry and Slim in unison. "Anyway," added the lieutenant, "I guess there'll be enough serious work for the rest of us when we get back. For instance," winking at the others, "there's that smashed tractor, Frank, that you have to explain." "Not so long as you were in charge of the party," Hoskins retorted quickly, and Lieutenant Mackinson, unable to determine whether the remark was a facetious evasion of responsibility or an indirect compliment to himself on the ground that no act of his would be questioned, pursued the bantering no further. "I guess," he said, "that Joe, Frank and I had better start back at once. You 2, We'll have to wait here some time before you can begin trailing that army. I'm sorry we can't stay with you, but I feel that we ought to report back as soon as possible." And so the three of them began the preparations for their return, while Slim and Jerry watched and studied the movements of the regiments they were to follow. "They seem to be pretty well tired out," said Slim at last. "Guess they didn't have any sleep all last night." "We're going to find it pretty heavy tramping through that snow, too," Jerry answered, "and with the wireless and rations we'll be carrying a hefty weight." "Well, boys, we're off," announced Lieutenant Mackinson, and the separating parties shook hands all around. "Take care of yourselves," he admonished, "and we'll look for you back by tomorrow." The officer, Joe, and Frank started off on their long tramp back to camp, and Jerry and Slim watched them until they were out of sight. "That looks like the last regiment of Germans going over the opposite hill there, too," said Jerry, as they turned to observe the enemy army. "We can start in a short while." And in half an hour, Jerry carrying the heavy pack set and Slim toting the equally heavy rations and incidentals, they set off on the Boches' trail. Out in the open, and especially in the mountains, distances are deceptive. Jerry and Slim learned this when they had been traveling for 2 hours, and the point where they had seen the last Germans disappear over the hilltop seemed as far away as when they had started. "Ever travel along in a train at night watching the moon, and notice how it seemed to move right along with you?" asked Jerry. "Lots of times," answered Slim, as he puffed along. "Why?" "Well, that's the way the hill seems to be traveling along, always keeping the same distance ahead of us." "I've heard of armies taking a fort or city or trench," asked Slim. "Do you suppose those Germans are taking that young mountain along with them?" "Seems so to me," said Jerry, coming to a halt to shift the heavy pack set to the other hand. As a matter of fact, early evening, a cold, biting winter evening, was settling about them when they finally climbed to the crest of that hill to cautiously see what they could see. Far beyond the slope ahead of them, in the dim dusk, they could discern a mass of men, evidently halted for the night. "That's their rear guard," announced Jerry, with his field glasses to his eyes. "I can even make out their sentries." Slim took a look and agreed. "Hadn't we better report?" he asked. "I think we ought to make this bunch of trees here our position, then scout ahead a little first," said Jerry. "All right," Slim agreed. "Which of us shall go?" "Let's toss." They did, and it fell to the lad who had claimed to have the scent of a deerhound to go out and reconnoiter, while the natural born scout remained behind. Divesting himself of all of his burdens but his revolver and ammunition belt, Slim started off, leaving Jerry to arrange their effects. He gave that young man a real shock when he silently returned 5 minutes later, unheard by Jerry, and standing only a half dozen feet behind him, and blurted out, "Forgot my field glasses." Jerry whirled around as though he had been shot. "Why don't you sneak up and try to frighten a fellow to death?" he demanded. "Sorry," Slim apologized. "I thought you heard me coming." "I believe you did it on purpose," Jerry growled, as the other youth again started off. "I'll send in my card next time," was Slim's parting remark. "Well, be sure to make yourself known," retorted Jerry, "or I might mistake you for a Boche and send in a bullet." Slim's laugh floated back, and he disappeared down a ravine through which he was making for a higher point of observation farther on. 10 minutes elapsed, and there was no sign of Slim. When a quarter of an hour had passed, Jerry began to worry. Had his friend perhaps fallen off and injured himself? Had he lost his way? A dozen fears came into Jerry's mind, and at the end of another 5 minutes he decided that it was time to take some measures to learn the whereabouts of Slim. Softly, but with great carrying force, he gave the well-known "whippoorwill." The answer was the same that Slim himself had received that night in No Man's Land, when the wounded and unconscious Rawle lay bleeding beside him. Nothing but absolute silence. A great dread that he could not have defined gripped Jerry's heart. Something had happened to Slim, there was no doubt about that. What was it? Injury? Death? Capture? Again Jerry gave their mutual Brighton signal, a whippoorwill. "He can't be entirely out of hearing," he argued. "There's some reason why he doesn't answer." It was fast growing dark. Sliding the pack set and their other paraphernalia into the little gully, which he could easily identify later, but where it would be entirely hidden from the view of anyone else who might chance upon the scene, Jerry set out in search of his friend. It was a difficult task that he set himself, for he knew no more than the general direction that Slim had taken. But remembering that his chum had started off down the ravine, and that his purpose was to reach a higher hill a quarter mile away, Jerry took that route too. 2 or 3 times, as he stumbled along, he snatched out his pocket searchlight and was about ready to use it when some sixth sense, plus the mystery of Slim's absence, prevailed upon him to take his chance in the darkness. Coming out of the ravine, he turned to the left and, by a steep incline, reached a ledge that seemed to be a natural pathway to one of the higher peaks. Suddenly the heart within him seemed to stop beating. Somewhere ahead of him, but seemingly upon a lower level of ground, men were talking, and they were talking in German. As though a bullet had struck him, Jerry dropped forward upon the ground. Grasping the outstretched roots of a tree, he pulled himself up within its heavy black shadow. There, scarcely daring to breathe for fear of attracting attention, he lay and listened. He thanked Brighton then for his understanding of the German language. Slim Goodwin was a prisoner, and those men, how many there were of them he could not tell, were questioning him. Slim was pretending not to understand. Jerry's brain worked rapidly. There was no use of his returning to the wireless and attempting to summon help that way, for even if his aid was sent, it would be hours before it could arrive. And presuming that his rescuers would find the spot, there was every likelihood that the Germans would have departed with their prisoner before that time. No, assuredly, if Slim was to be rescued, he, Jerry, must do it. But how? As he lay there thinking, he heard the one who seemed to be the officer in charge order another man to build a fire. As it crackled and began to blaze up, the reflections of the flame gave Jerry their exact location. Also, it formed a curtain of light against which it would have been easy for him to have seen any Boche sentinel or outpost, had there been one between him and them. Assuring himself there was not, he crept cautiously forward, foot by foot, until he was at the edge of the shelf of rock and could gaze down almost directly upon them. The fire gave good illumination. There was a young German lieutenant and 4 of his men. A short distance away, in the shelter of some trees, 5 horses were tethered. Slim finally had consented to talk, if what he was doing could be called talking, and what was purposely the most miserably broken German imaginable. He was telling them that he got separated from his unit several days ago, which was true, and that he had been wandering around that part of the country for the last couple of days, which also was true, and that he did not know where he was, which likewise was the truth. While this was going on, Jerry had scribbled a piece of paper, and nearby, "Look lively if they sleep." This he wrapped around a small stone. For a moment all the Germans turned toward the fire, where one of the men was preparing evening supper. In that instant Jerry tossed the message straight at Slim's feet. Slim gave a little start, recovered himself immediately, stooped over and pretended to wash his hands in the snow, unwrapped and hastily read the note, and trampled it into the ground. When one of the Germans turned suddenly, he was innocently drying his hands. End of chapter 18. Of the Brighton Boys in the Radio Service. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Tom Clifton. The Brighton Boys in the Radio Service by James R. Driscoll. Chapter 19. Turning the Tables. To Jerry, laying there half frozen, stiff in every joint and scarcely daring to move for fear of making some sound that might not only divulge his presence and result in his own capture, but also prevent the escape of Slim, it seemed that never did it take men so long to eat a meal. And as they ate, his own appetite became ravenous. The cruelest punishment of all was to lie there half starved and hear them vulgarly smacking their lips over the warmed up remains of a chicken, undoubtedly filched from a countryside barnyard. But at last, after what seemed to Jerry to have been hours of feasting, they did finish. With a derisive laugh, the German lieutenant gathered all the bones from every other tin plate and shoved them with mock courtesy toward Slim. The latter was biding his time, and, his courage increased by knowing that his friend was close by, refused to get angry. He merely waved the plate aside. Their stomachs filled, the Germans almost immediately began to think about sleep. In truth, they all looked as though they had been up most of the night before, as probably they had. One of them, a mere youth, certainly not yet out of his teens, and the youngest in the party, yawned. The lieutenant saw it, and in a fit of apparently unreasonable anger said in his own native tongue: "So you want to serve notice that you desire sleep? Very well, you shall do sentinel duty, and all night, and mind that you do not sleep." A pitiful look came over the boy's face, but without a word he saluted and departed to the circle of outer shadows to take up his long and tedious vigil. Jerry felt genuinely sorry for him, but he sincerely hoped that the officer would not change his mind or relent. He knew that the youth could not possibly stay awake the whole night through. Half an hour later the other four Germans were conducting a spirited rivalry in snoring, and Slim, also to all appearances, was fast asleep. Not daring to move, Jerry kept his eyes constantly upon the young sentry. Frequently he yawned. Once or twice he stopped uncertainly before a stump and seemed about to sit down, and then started on again about its monotonous beat, but his step was wavering, his eyes were heavy, and Jerry knew it was only a question of time, a comparatively short time, when nature would conquer and the sentinel, too, would sleep. Had he been able to bring himself to it, he could have shot the sentry and killed the others as they slept, before they could even have reached their weapons, but he could not do that. Better the other way, he told himself, even though it carried a greater risk. And finally his own vigil was rewarded. The sentinel placed 2 or 3 more pieces of wood upon the fire, stood for a few moments within its genial warmth, looked dully at the others soundly sleeping, and then crossed to the stump and sat down. His rifle was on the ground beside him. His elbows rested upon his knees and his chin in his hands. Presently his eyelids drooped and closed. His head, and then his whole body, sagged forward. He awakened with a start, and changed his place to another tree more within the shadows. There he was able to lean back in a more comfortable position, and soon his heavy, even breathing assured Jerry that nature had indeed won. Softly, without so much as a sound, he rose to his hands and knees. He tossed a pebble which hit Slim upon the hand. The latter turned his head ever so slightly and gazed fixedly in Jerry's direction. Finally his decided wink indicated that he had made out the form of his friend. Still upon all fours, and feeling every inch of the way, Jerry retraced his steps over the ledge. Quietly he slid down to the lower level and took a wide circle about the little camp, finally closing in near to where the sleeping sentry sat. Deftly and silently he pulled the latter's gun from where it lay beside him. This he carried over to near where the horses were corralled. Slim was watching his every move, but awaited Jerry's signal before he stirred. Jerry then returned, and ever so gently that the sentry never made a movement, lifted his loaded revolver from its holster. With this he tiptoed to Slim, placed the weapon in his hand, and with a gesture bade him to rise. They were now masters of the situation, but Jerry did not want to take any chances. 2 of the Germans were lying in such a position that he could get their revolvers also. They did not carry rifles. This he accomplished after having stationed Slim in the shadows at such a point of vantage that he could cover all the Boches should they awaken. One of the additional guns he gave to Slim, the other he kept himself. Thus, doubly armed, they stepped over to the sleeping sentry, and while Slim pointed his 2 guns at the others to prevent any hostilities upon their part should they arise, Jerry shook and awakened the bewildered sentry. As he faced the 2 revolvers and the changed situation suddenly dawned upon him, the young German's expression was pathetic. Apparently he was too stunned to speak a word. Jerry motioned him to take position just behind the sleepers, which he did. With Slim standing behind him and their 4 revolvers pointed menacingly at the Germans, Jerry kicked the lieutenant upon the sole of the boot. The latter aroused angrily and was about to give vent to his feelings when he looked into the barrels of the automatics. His exclamation was one of complete chagrin. Slim stepped over and extracted his revolver, which he dropped in his own pocket. By the same process the other armed Boche was awakened, and in the same way he was disarmed. Then with his foot Jerry jabbed the remaining 2 back to consciousness. "You are our prisoners," Jerry informed them in their own language. "One hostile move from any of you and you'll be shot." Forming them into pairs, and purposely leaving the sentinel as the single one of the party and in the lead, Jerry ordered them to walk to where the horses were tethered. He made 2 of the men put saddles and bridles upon the animals, and then compelled them to mount as they were paired. The lieutenant and one of his men upon one of the horses, 2 others upon another, and the sentry alone upon another, but carrying a good supply of rations. while Slim and he each had an animal to carry themselves, the wireless and other paraphernalia when they should pick that up. Thus, with hardly a dozen words having been spoken, they came through the ravine and at forced speed struck out across the level ground towards the mountain from which Jerry and Slim had come that morning. "You," the lieutenant hissed between his teeth at the sentinel as they came side by side, "what were you doing when the second American arrived? Asleep, eh?" "I came up behind him. He never had a chance, for I did not make a sound," Jerry interposed in German, before the young Boche could even make an involuntary admission. As they approached the base of the mountain, where they had parted from Lieutenant Mackinson, Joe and Frank early that day, the moon reached its zenith, and its beams reflected upon the white ground, making the night almost as light as day. 2 hours later they were upon the identical spot from which they had wirelessed headquarters in the morning. It was midnight now as two of the Germans, working under Jerry's orders while Slim kept a weather eye on the others, set up the pack set. Jerry worked the key half a dozen times and then got an almost immediate response. The first query after he identified himself was: "This is Joe. Where are you?" "I just got back to where he left you this morning," Jerry ticked off into the air, "bringing in a German lieutenant and 4 of his men as prisoners. Should arrive by daylight, as we have horses." "Great," was Joe's response. "Have a letter from Brighton and fine news. We'll make your report." And the pack set was put back in its compartment case, and, paired off as before, the journey was resumed. "Say," said Jerry, as they urged their horses down the side of the mountain leading to fairly level ground all the way to camp, "I'm hungry enough to eat dog meat, but I guess we can hold out now until we reach our lines." "Yes, I suppose so," Slim answered. "But how'd you like to have some sausages and plum pudding and—" "Don't," pleaded Jerry. "That idea is too much. My stomach is accusing me of gross carelessness now." "Wonder what's in that letter from Brighton and who wrote it," said some, glad to change the subject, and forgot his own hunger. "Can't imagine, but my own curiosity has been to whether the fine news Joe mentioned comes from there or refers to something at headquarters." And so, sore, tired and hungry, but happy withal, they continued on. The moon waned and set, and tradition proved itself. It became darkest just before dawn. "Wait," said Jerry, just at the stage of the journey, and he jumped from his horse to recover something he had seen the German lieutenant drop. It proved to be a packet of papers bearing the official German seal. "Aha!" Jerry cried, riding up to the officer and thrusting the documents out before him. "So you thought to get rid of them, eh? Well, we'll just take these along to headquarters, too. They may contain something of interest to our commanders, yes?" The lieutenant gave an ugly, menacing grunt, but refused to say a word. Daylight came, and with a clear view of the American lines, a quarter hour later, they saw 2 horsemen coming toward them. Slim examined them carefully with his glasses. "The lieutenant and Frank," he announced. "Guess Joe's still on duty." And Joe was. He was just relaying to the commander of the American forces in France orders forwarded from London, and they were of the greatest importance to the 3 boys from Brighton. End of chapter 19. Of the Brighton Boys in the Radio Service. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Tom Clifton. The Brighton Boys in the Radio Service by James R. Driscoll. Chapter 20. The Great News. "Well, sergeants, how are you?" Lieutenant Mackinson greeted them as he and Frank came galloping up and swerved their horses around. "Corporals, you mean, Lieutenant," Jerry corrected. "No, I thought I meant sergeants," the lieutenant repeated. "In fact, I'm quite sure I did." "What do you mean?" Slim demanded eagerly, for the moment forgetting all about their prisoners of war. "Just what I said. Sergeant," said Lieutenant Mackinson, smiling. "Have we do you?" Jerry stopped to begin all over again, and the young officer interrupted him. "I suppose it's a little like telling secrets out of school," he said, "but then, after all, it isn't any secret, for the news was out yesterday afternoon. A lot of promotions were announced. Frank's been made a corporal, and you boys, Joe too, advanced to sergeant." It was fully a minute before either lad could express himself, and the lieutenant and Corporal Hoskins took a full measure of enjoyment out of their apparent happy gratification. "Lieutenant," Slim began. "Captain, if you please," Mr. Mackinson corrected amiably. "You see, I was in that list too." Slim and Jerry simultaneously brought their horses to a halt while they came to a full military salute. As they approached Major Jones's headquarters with their prisoners, Captain Mackinson turned another way and Corporal Hoskins dropped back. Briefly, and without undue emphasis upon their own hardships or courage or common sense, they gave the details of their activities since they had left, and of the capture of Slim and the subsequent taking of his captors. "You have done well, exceptionally well," the major responded. "In consequence whereof it gives me great pleasure to inform you that you have been advanced to the rank of sergeant. With that respect I might remind you that the next step is to a commission, and that merit and courage will take a man to any command in the United States Army, if this is the only standard of advancement and there is no other instrument of preferment. I am happy to know that you young men have started so well. You two and the friend who was also advanced to sergeant with you have brilliant futures before you." They were saluting, preliminary to departure, when the major added: "You will report to General Young, division commander, at 10 o'clock." A little bewildered by the salutes of those privates who knew of their promotion, even though they did not yet wear upon their sleeves the two stripes indicating their advance to corporals, Jerry and Slim hurried toward the wash spigots, preliminary to an assault upon the mess tent. There they met Joe, who had just come off duty as the night wireless operator at headquarters. They shook hands, and then Slim demanded to know about that letter from Brighton. "It was from our old friend, the telegrapher, Phil Burton," said Joe, "and it was written about 3 weeks ago."
"That's pretty quick delivery," said Slim. "What did he have to say?"
"Well, it seems they've had reports there of some of our experiences coming over, and Mr. Burton says some of the finest things." "Good old Burton," mused Jerry. "He always did credit us with being a lot better and brighter and more capable than we really were." "Yes, and we owe him a lot," added Slim, "for he was really responsible in the first place for our getting here. If it hadn't been for what he taught us about telegraphy, we'd never be sergeants now." "That's right," said Joe. "Fellows, Mr. Burton's getting along pretty well now. He'll be an old man before very long. I wish we three could do something to really show him our appreciation of what he's been to us." "We will," Jerry said. "We will. Let's make a promise to each other on that." And with this good resolution made, they started for the mess tent. The first 15 minutes they gave over unstintedly to appeasing healthy and long deferred appetites, and then Slim suddenly remembered Major Jones's final instructions. "Wonder what we have to report at General Young's headquarters at 10 o'clock for?" he queried. "I'm nearly dead for sleep myself." "So am I," said Jerry. Both of them caught Joe's averted smile. "What's it for, do you know?" Jerry demanded. "Well, fellows, I think I do," Joe answered. "But I only learned it over the wireless, and that information's gained in a professional way, you know, and therefore is a secret. So don't ask me to tell you. In another hour we'll go over. You know I've been summoned, too." "No!" ejaculated Jerry. "Well, that's fine, but you'll be going over to learn something that you already know, while we'll be getting some real news, whatever it is." "That's right," said Joe, "and maybe it will be real news." Jerry and Slim both spent the intervening hour on their cots, and when Joe came to awaken them he found them snoring most unmusically. "What do you think?" he demanded, as soon as they were wide enough awake to realize what he was saying. "That German lieutenant you brought in had papers on him that showed the whole plan of the German campaign in this sector for a month ahead. You boys made a great capture." At exactly 10 o'clock they presented themselves to General Young's orderly, and a moment later were ushered into the presence of the supreme commander of that section of the American front. "Young men," the general began bluntly, without other formalities, "you have signally distinguished yourselves for judgment, foresight and courage from the moment of your enlistment. It might be said I have before me your records, beginning from the time of your discovery of the spy at work in the waters near the Philadelphia Navy Yard. Congress has just passed a bill, and the President has signed it, providing for the higher military education of certain worthy young men in the Army and Navy, entirely at the expense of the government. Fortunately for the military service, these selections have been entirely removed from the realm of politicians and are left to the commanders of the Army and Navy. At this school, which in many respects is similar to the Military Academy at West Point and the Naval Academy at Annapolis, young men will be thoroughly instructed in the specialized branches of military science. I am offering you three young men such appointments. I am doing so solely upon your records and upon my own confidence that you will make good to the country that offers you this opportunity. Will you accept?" If somebody had suddenly set off a bomb under the three boys from Brighton, they could hardly have been more surprised. "I don't know how to thank you," Joe stammered. "I'll do my utmost to prove worthy of it," promised Jerry. "It shall be my highest ambition," said Slim. "Good," said General Young, raising and shaking each lad by the hand. "I was confident that you would accept, and here are the appointments, already made out." He gave each lad a large envelope stamped with the Army seal. "Transportation has been arranged for you to leave here to night," General Young concluded. "You will sail from England to the United States day after to morrow. I wish you every success. I would be very glad to hear from you occasionally and to know of the progress you are making. Good bye." It would be difficult to describe the ecstasies of delight in which Joe, Jerry and Slim left the quarters of General Young to impart the knowledge of their great good fortune to Captain Mackinson. That warm friend listened to them until he could not keep his countenance straight any longer. "I forgot to tell you," he said, "that I am to go back there also as an instructor." "Isn't that luck!" exclaimed Slim, expressing the sentiment of the other two. "That just about makes it perfect." So we leave the boys from Brighton, Joe and Jerry and Slim, leave them upon the threshold of their broader careers which merit has won them, and bid them carry always with them our very best wishes in their aspirations, which we know ever will be onward and upward. End of chapter 20. End of the Brighton Boys in the radio service.
Morse code sound effects in Chapter 4 are created by the reader, Tom Clifton, and are dedicated to the public domain.